Hello, everyone, and welcome to our introduction to the executive branch. We're going to talk about the president today. So finally, in this, I don't even know where we are in school at this point. Is it the middle? Is it the end? Is it the end of the beginning? Is it the beginning of the end? I don't know. Nothing makes any sense. I think it's Wednesday. You'll probably see this. I don't know. Time has no meaning. But we're talking about the presidency. So we're kind of identifying 7 major roles, different hats that the president has to wear. And these have changed throughout time. Some of these have not always been considered to be important roles of the presidency. They've been ones that have emerged later in history. Others of them have been there from the very start. I think this one is one that's really been with us from the start, and that is the idea of the president as the head of state or chief of state. And as the slide says, as chief of state, the president exercises his authority as the highest representative of the United States government to the country and the world. These duties include the ceremonial duties of president, awarding medals, hosting world leaders, etc. And when you think about what one person represents the country, it's the president. The president is the closest thing that we have to a king or queen, right? We don't have a monarchy, but in their stead, we have the president. And so the president is the person who, gives out awards, who hosts foreign leaders, who has fancy dinners, who goes to the United Nations. The president is the one who gives out military honors. And one other role that I think is important here is that the president has sometimes been called the consoler-in-chief. When really bad things happen, it's considered to be the president's responsibility to go and kind of soothe the nation. And some of the most famous presidential speeches have been consoling speeches. Some of them consoling but also challenging the nation to further action. You think about, Franklin Roosevelt, the day that will live in infamy after Pearl Harbor, telling the United States that they were now at war with Japan. Or you think about George W. Bush after September 11th, giving his speech, saying that, we were going to go after the people who had done this. And then you have some other incidents. I think of Ronald Reagan's speech after the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. That was a very highly praised speech, talking about the tragic loss of American astronauts. And so these kind of duties as being the face that everyone can point to that represents the country is an important role of the presidency, but by no means the only role. Another role is that of chief executive, and this is one of the things that is definitely part of the president's role as it's outlined in the Constitution. Like the chief of state is very ceremonial. While it's been with us from the beginning, the traditions of the office have grown up over time. Even like the traditions of calling the president Mr. President. That's something that people didn't do at first. It was something that George Washington actually came up with. Other people had crazy ideas. They wanted to call the president like his Republican Majesty. It's all kinds of crazy stuff. The chief executive is where you get to the actual constitutional functions of the presidency. So, as the chief executive, the president executes the office of the presidency. So what does that mean? Well, that means signing executive orders. So the president gets to make some decisions about how laws are carried out. The president cannot make law himself, but many laws kind of give the president authority to do different kinds of things under those laws depending on the circumstances. And so the president can issue these executive orders and other executive declarations to basically make the government work. We think about like when there's a hurricane, right? So there's a hurricane, city is devastated, they declare a disaster, and the president helps direct the federal government and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, aka FEMA, to go send money, send food, send shelter to that place. Certainly the president's response to this COVID virus has been informed by laws that have been previously passed that give the president the power to mobilize parts of the federal government to respond to a national health crisis. And so, this is kind of George W. Bush liked to call himself the decider. And this is kind of the decider part of the presidency. This is where the president has to make decisions about what's going to happen in the federal government under the authority that he has and he can. And so that's basically how does the government go about implementing the laws that have been passed. The president is also the chief administrator. This sounds similar, but as the executive has to do about the what is the government going to do, the chief administrator is more about the who is going to do these things. So the president is the boss of basically everyone in the federal bureaucracy. He gets to hire and fire all these people who work under him, including his immediate staff, like his chief of staff, his communications director, all these people. But he also has a cabinet, like the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Treasury Secretary. All these people he gets to hire, and he can also fire those people if he wants to. And there's also positions under those. For example, the Secretary of Defense also has working under him the Secretary of the Navy, the Secretary of the Army, and the Secretary of the Air Force. And the president can fire those people too. Basically, the president can fire just about anybody in the federal government and has a strong role in deciding who those people are going to be. So, for a lot of these positions, the Senate has to confirm them, so the president can fire the Secretary of State, but then if he wants to pick a new one, he has to go through the Senate to do it. He does get to be the person who gets to name the names, and then the Senate has to say yes or no. So the chief administrator is mostly about personnel management. The president wants to put the people in the positions in the federal government so that they carry out his agenda, or her agenda, if we have a female president someday. So the president puts these people in power, and so this is why, when there's a new president, all these people change. You'll see it occasionally, but usually all these executive positions will be vacated, and the new president will fill it in with new people because they want people who are going to be loyal to them and loyal to their policy agenda. Trump didn't want to keep a lot of the people that Obama had because those people wanted to do what Obama wanted to do, not what Trump wanted to do. So he switched those people out. So as the chief administrator, the president has these roles to, decide who's going to administer the various parts of the federal bureaucracy, because obviously the president can't do everything himself. The president is considered the chief diplomat of the United States. So the chief diplomat, he's the person who leads negotiations. Now, he has a lot of help doing this. We have ambassadors to most of the countries on Earth. We have the Secretary of State, who's supposed to oversee those ambassadors and does a lot of negotiating himself. But at the end of the day, the Secretary of State reports to the president. And so the person who really lays out the negotiating position of the United States, whether it's on trade, negotiating with other countries for trading things or changing tariff rates, or if it's on a military treaty or anything like that, the ultimate person who decides what the position of the United States is the president. And so the president is ultimately the one who gets to negotiate treaties, alliances, and trade agreements with other countries. Again, these oftentimes have to be ratified by the Senate, but the Senate, has to basically follow what the president laid out. And so the president can, negotiate these treaties with other countries, and then he puts it in front of the Senate, and the Senate has to say yes or no. Commander-in-Chief. I think this is one that we're probably very familiar with. The president is the leader of the U.S. military. His job includes deciding where and when the United States will attack, helping develop military strategy, and coordinating fighting with our allies. So again, the president has a lot of help. He has a Secretary of Defense. He's got the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's got the National Security Council. There's lots of other people who can give the president advice and say, based on our understanding of military strategy, our understanding of the, political security situation, we think you should do this. But strategists are not always going to agree. Sometimes the president is going to get conflicting advice. One person might come in and say, I think we really need to bomb Iran. And another person might come in and say, no, we really don't want to do that because that's going to start a war with Iran we don't want to have. And so at that point, the president has to say, all right, guys, this is what we're going to do. And so as commander-in-chief, the ultimate decision to use military force and what way military force is used is left up to the president. Obviously, the president isn't commanding individual troops in battle. I don't think a sitting president has ever done that. But the president, in theory, could. A soldier is supposed to, any soldier in the United States military is supposed to follow any lawful order given to them by the president of the United States. The one area where the president does not have authority over the military is in the military budget. Because spending is the exclusive power of Congress, the budget of the military is set by Congress. And also, only Congress can declare war. But this is where we get into this weird kind of differentiation of presidential power. In theory, the president could order the military to attack a country without declaring war on it, and then he could go to Congress and say, well, I really need you to approve the budget for the military to attack this country, and you should probably declare war while you're doing it. And Congress could be like, wait, what? How did this happen? We didn't approve any of this. And the president could then go and say, well, I know, but what are you going to do now? We already attacked. Are we just going to pull out and go home at this point? Are you going to fail to approve the budget for the transport so we just leave the troops there? No, you're not going to do that. So, in many ways, the president basically can start wars without necessarily declaring wars, although his ability to do that has been something that Congress has kind of tried to rein in over time. In theory now, the president can only conduct military operations for 90 days without congressional approval. Although, with nuclear weapons, you can imagine that in 90 days you could get yourself into a lot of trouble. Chief legislator. This is one that's kind of new. When the country was first started, the president was not really seen to have a big job in terms of deciding what the laws were going to be. Presidents, would probably push one way or the other and would have an opinion, but in terms of actually proposing laws, the president really stayed out of that. He left that up to Congress. And of course, it is Congress's job to make the laws. The president can't even introduce a bill to Congress. Only a congressman can do that, or a congresswoman, or a senator. But because the president has the veto power, and because the president is so closely associated with kind of our political life in this country, right? The president goes out on campaign and says, when I'm president, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And the thing that you always got to understand is that the president very rarely actually can just do that when he takes office. He usually is going to need Congress to pass laws to help him do those things. And so when the president gets elected, he comes in with a policy agenda. Sometimes back in the day, these agendas would have names, right? We think about Franklin Roosevelt with the New Deal, historic example. Teddy Roosevelt with the Square Deal before him, or John F. Kennedy with the New Frontier. These are policy packages, basically, so that the president would come in and then he'd go to Congress as soon as he was elected and say, all right, Congress, new boss in town, and I would like you to take up these issues. Congress doesn't always do that. And oftentimes what the president gets back from Congress is not exactly what he was hoping for. But the president's job to kind of use his, public persona to cajole Congress, encourage them to move on issues and take up his priorities, is a powerful motivator for Congress, especially because since the president can veto things he doesn't like, Congress is unlikely to take up legislation that the president disagrees with. Is this the last one? This is the last one. All right, and lastly, and this is another one that's kind of grown through time, but has been, I think, true at least since the middle of the 1800s, is that the president is the chief of his political party. As the highest-ranking officer in, or highest-ranking politician in the United States, the party that the president belongs to, obviously that's their party. The president controls that political party in many ways. And so and you can really see this, I think, with Trump and the Republican Party. When Trump was running to be the Republican nominee, his positions were not necessarily the positions that were traditionally the positions of the Republican Party. Trump had some new ideas, especially Trump's very anti-immigrant stance. Historically, the Republican Party had not really taken a strong stance on immigration. Trump obviously changed that. Once Trump got elected, as the chief, the highest ranking person in the Republican Party, his views basically became the views of the Republican Party. So as the side said, the president is considered the leader of his political party. The president is expected to campaign for members of his party. So there's kind of an expectation that says, hey, this person is a big public persona. They're going to bring lots of press. They're going to bring lots of attention. That the president go and campaign for people in his party that are running for Congress or running for Senate to help them win. The president's views on issues are assumed to be the party's views as well. And then finally, the president is expected to be a standard bearer for what their party represents in terms of values and personal beliefs. And this is one that I think, you could certainly find examples of that not being true. But oftentimes when you do, it's things that are controversial. Where the party says, well, we believe in this, and then the president goes out and does something that is definitely not that, then that oftentimes is areas where the president gets into trouble. But the president is supposed to kind of be this representative of, what their party stands for. And if, you can support the president, then you should be able to support his party too, or so goes the argument. So those are the main roles of the presidency. Again, head of state or chief of state, chief executive, chief administrator, chief negotiator, chief legislator, commander-in-chief, and chief of party. And so all these together are kind of all the different things that the president has to keep an eye on. Some of them are, very policy-oriented, dealing with what the country is doing from, a law standpoint. Some of them are very political-oriented, especially chief of party. This is obviously something that's basically about his political fortunes and those of his party rather than, executing the laws of the United States. Nevertheless, every president has to kind of balance the, political side of their office with the policy side of their office. All right, folks, I hope you enjoyed that lecture and answer the questions that go along with it. And have a great weekend. See you guys on Monday.